Uh, and his professional experience include honorary associate professorship in neurology, GMC, and Sir J.J. Hospital, Mumbai. He's also a visiting fellow in epilepsy, Cleveland Clinic, USA. He has been a consultant neurologist in Lilavati Hospital, Holy Family Hospital, Guru Nanak Hospital, and Srimati BCJ General Hospital, Ramakrishna Mission Hospital, and a lot of other hospitals in Mumbai. He's also working as an associate professor and in charge of the Department of Neurology in TN Medical College and BYL Nair Hospital in Mumbai. Has been a lecturer in neurology. He's a founder trustee of the FINE or Forum of Indian Neurology Education, which organizes teaching courses in neurology. So he's one of the members of the steering committee of ELICIT, which is the interdisciplinary task force for intensivists, palliative care physicians, and neurologists for end-of-life care in India. So we just got a small message from Dr. Roop that he'll be joining us 5 minutes late. So till then, maybe we can all have a discussion about the present topic, which is end of life care. So I would like to invite, all of you to give in your inputs, or maybe you can share your experiences while dealing with patients who you have seen in the end of life care. So anybody could actually start. And if I could actually request Dr. Rakesh Mittal, sir, you are the most experienced one in between us today. So maybe you can share your views on end of life care.
Thank you, Sanghmitra. I was also unfortunate to see many end of the life patients because I was in oncology, and in adult oncology, most of the patient they. But the thing is that the, in our setting, particularly in the government hospital setting, most of the time when we realize that the patient has reached a stage of no cure, we tend to send them home because the government hospitals are already overburdened by the number, a large number. We don't keep them in the hospital for the end of life care. So I really don't know what exactly happened to them in the hospital, in their homes, because I was never really involved with that kind of a care, although I really want to be involved. But in Bangalore, there is a one Karunashara is there, which is too far from my house. Otherwise, I would have joined them and seen myself how the end of life care is given. But we have seen, like in pediatric, I have cared because in pediatric we don't send them normally to home. We tend to take care at hospital. So it is a very difficult situation and very painful experience to see people dying. And it is not easy for anybody, particularly to see the relative, to the if it is child, to see the parents how they die every minute when they see their child dying. So it is a very difficult situation. But as I said, I have not particularly taken care of adult patients who are in the end of life care. But it is a very delicate subject which needs a lot of compassion and dedication. And in our hospitals in our country these days, I remember that previously 90% of the patients used to die at home. But now what has happened that 90% of the patients are dying in the hospital. And the relatives are insisting that no, you must do everything possible till the last breath. They want them to keep in the hospital. They keep trying something and another. While I personally feel a dying person should die at home in their own environment. This is my personal belief. Many times I was not able to convince the relatives that no, you should take them home. Although
Absolutely, absolutely, sir. Thank you so much for sharing this. And I think this is a good start to the whole session. Dr. Roop has joined us. Good afternoon, Dr. Roop.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, absolutely. We can definitely hear you. So
Okay.
by the time you joined, we were just discussing, we started on, experiences that our participants have got regarding the end of life care. So, sir, it will be very nice of you to start off with your session. We are all waiting to learn from you, sir. Yeah.
Uh, Sanghamitra, what a pleasure to see you after so long.
Yeah, me too, sir. How are you?
Yeah,
How are
nice.
you?
Great,
Yeah.
great.
And Happy New Year to you, sir.
Happy New Year.
Yeah, thank you.
Are
Thank you.
you, you are in Guwahati, I hope, unless you've
I
landed up
am
in
in
Turkey.
Guwahati. I'm in Guwahati, sir.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So, I'd like to begin by thanking Paleo India for getting me to speak on one of my favorite topics. And it's great to meet Dr. Sanghamitra after quite a long while. And I'll get started. So let me share my screen. Yes, I think I have opened it. Um, Sorry, just a minute. Yeah, is it there?
Yeah, sir. We can see. Yeah.
Right. So I got the last bit of the conversation which Dr. Sangamitra was having about patients who are dying in hospital and how do we tackle the situation. I am going to take a little broader perspective because we tend to look at this very often from a doctor's perspective. Let's look at it from a citizen's perspective. We are, you, me, all of us, sooner or later, we are going to be in that boat as well. So I'm going to start by asking you to think about your own death, right? Dying with pain and suffering. So the best words on this were said by Woody Allen. He said, I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there when it happens, which is actually a lot of people's position. Don't think about it, don't talk about it, just disappear. Right. Now, one of the things that we are very good at measuring quality of life in terms of well-being, in terms of physical health, psychological state, so on, and you will find lots of literature on this. Do we think about quality of death? And if we do, probably the only way to assess it is by thinking of it from the principle of a good life till the very end. And what you need to look at is minimizing suffering. But for that, you have to measure suffering and then you can work on improving it. And it's also equally important for us to uh, understand patient rights at the end of life. I'm going to, yeah, I need to turn on the laser pointer. Here's my laser pointer. Right. So the first start is with setting boundaries. Now, you all know that palliative care is applicable to all serious health related suffering, practically from the time of diagnosis on. And just remember that in cancer, well, this trajectory may be a matter of years, but in dementia, it can be a matter of decades from the time of diagnosis till the time of death. So, how do we define end of life care? Uh, End of life care, not the end of life, is taken as months to 1 year. So, you can see that this is now beginning to be a bit of a retrospective judgment. Terminal care is weeks to months. But this is where we enter into again into a clinical entity, and that is called actively dying. This is based on physiological parameters. It's usually irreversible and it is measured in days to hours. So, between this to this, how do we traverse these rather ill defined boundaries? So, we need definitions. And this definition was put out by the ICMR, by a group of which I was part. Terminal illness is one from which recovery cannot be expected with the available treatment, and death is considered to be unavoidable in the foreseeable future. As you can see, we've kept things a little vague. End of life care is an approach to a terminally ill patient that shifts the focus of care to symptom control, comfort, quality of life, and quality of dying with support for the family. Treatments aimed at cure and or prolongation of life can be stopped. So to understand this, we must understand how diseases behave at the end of life. And this comes from one of the most quoted graphics in palliative care. These are four trajectories that people have towards the end of life. Everybody hopes for sudden death, but let me assure you, you have to have a lot of punya like this gentleman to get sudden death after the age of 50. Before the age of 50, all those people who do risky behaviors like driving motorcycles, becoming terrorists or soldiers, smoking too much, well, they are usually gone. And after the age of 50 years, less than 10% people die suddenly. He died. He died lecturing, in fact. Uh, then we look at the other trajectories. Of them, probably the most prominent, but not the most common, is what we call terminal illness. Terminal illness usually refers to cancer, but in neurology, it also refers to something like motor neuron disease. Typically, these are people in their 60s, and we call this the waterfall trajectory because once cancer reaches a stage where it is no longer in remission, no longer in control, it is inexorable. Death really depends on tumor burden, and that as that goes on increasing, eventually you have a fairly defined point. And this causes about 20% of all deaths. Again, you may recognize this picture of former defense minister and the chief minister of Goa, Mr. Parikar. The next is organ failure. And organ failure means somebody who's reached the 70s with diabetes, hypertension, lung, liver failure. And these patients, because of organ failure, they end up coming into hospital in crisis, coming back out not as good as they were before, gradually going down, but usually through courses of crisis until finally one crisis carries them off. We call this the looping trajectory. And I will not show you any VIP here because VIPs get organ transplants. So then you come to somebody, unlike say this or this, people who have come from very good function. You come to somebody whose functioning is as it is pretty low. These are people in their late 70s or 80s, frail and with often with dementia, but often just with old age. So 80s, 90s, sometimes even starting off in the 70s. And we call this the dwindling trajectory. Remember that Atal Bihari Vajpayee lost an election in 2004 and we didn't hear of him again until he passed away in 2018. Right? So we call this the dwindling trajectory and it can be very, very long. But there is a fifth trajectory that has been identified more in practice, and that is called the catastrophic event trajectory. This is somebody who is otherwise functioning well, and their brain is hit by a stroke or a truck, that is traumatic brain injury. Somebody needs to mute. Somebody needs to mute, please. And these people from high functioning individuals suddenly come down to the dwindling trajectory. So this is called the fifth trajectory. Now, the point to note is that in elderly individuals, this may be a systemic event also. In younger individuals, it's always catastrophic brain injury. In the elderly, it can be a systemic event. If you watch out, you will occasionally see somebody who has a hip fracture, comes into hospital, gets operated, post-operatively has a somewhat stormy course, and never comes back to normal. So, can we foresee and foretell death? Remember that this foreseeing and foretelling was part of our duties from the time of Hippocrates. Why? So that men will have confidence to entrust themselves to such a physician in the presence of the sick who can tell the present, the past, and the future. But that often doesn't happen. This is because This is not the time of Hippocrates. This is the time of, well, modern ages. And our patients are empowered. Because they are empowered, they want us to prognosticate. Honestly, yes. Accurately, yes. But also optimistically. And we find it difficult to put these three things together. But we can do it. And this is one source. You'll find others. For instance, this is a table that predicts 1 year mortality in, uh, usually it works in very elderly individuals. So take this man who's male, who needs assistance with all activities of daily living. So 1 plus 5, 6 points, and also has a serum albumin that is below 30. Usually below 25 also works. So 8 points. Anyone who has more than 6 points has a 64% 1 year mortality risk. So what does this mean? If you take 64% and extend that into subsequent years, you have somebody who has a barely 3 to 5% chance of surviving beyond, say, the next 3 years. Do we tell our patients and our families that? No, we don't. So the point I'm trying to make, and if you look at the trajectories, is that most deaths can be anticipated, though only a minority are unexpected. If we recognize this decline, if we anticipate needs, if we plan, we can have people living and dying in the place and the manner of their choice, in control of their futures. Uh, to do this, we are going to use something called the gold standards framework, and I suggest you read this. But the discussion that follows is largely based on this. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. So, to recognize terminal illness, we should actually identify any one of these four triggers. Uh, these four triggers, I'm starting with general indicators of decline, some of which you've seen, specific clinical indicators, which you've seen, which you'll see a little further in detail. But there are two that are important to understand conceptually. The first is called the surprise question. And we are all familiar with a senior physician saying so and so is not going to last so long. So and so is likely to. And I remember being surprised the first time I heard one of my seniors actually say that. But I've realized that if I intuitively use, uh, sorry, if I intuitively uh, look at a clinical situation and ask myself this question: would I be surprised if this patient were to die in the next year or in the next few months, weeks, or days? I find that with experience, my accuracy is now reasonably high. I don't think I ever statistically analyzed it, but I think I'm close to about 70 to 80% accurate. Oncologists, experienced oncologists can hit 80 to 90%. So we'll be discussing that a little further. Decisional is when we change the management focus from disease directed to only comfort care. So the surprise question, I've already discussed this in a little detail, is if you answer no to the following question: would you be surprised if this patient were to die in the next year? Uh, this has to be an intuitive answer. It puts together clinical, comorbidity, social, and other factors to get a whole picture of deterioration. And it has, even otherwise, been assessed to have an accuracy of about 70 to 80% and perhaps a little more. The general indicators of decline basically refer to decreasing activity. So somebody who cannot take care of themselves, is in bed or chair more than 50% of the day, and has increasing dependence in most activities of daily living, well, ideally, you should assess this systematically. So, for instance, you have the Karnofsky performance status score. And if you look down through it, you can see, if you take your patient's history carefully, you can see patients declining through this. And when they decline to about 20 to 30%, you know that depending on the etiology, the time is now fairly limited. Another indicator of morbidity and mortality is comorbidity. So somebody who has multiple illnesses is that much more likely to go down faster. Advanced disease, it's not necessarily just cancer alone. It could be something like severe constipation verging on obstipation and Parkinsonism. That's a marker of mortality. or somebody whose diabetes is no longer getting controlled. Other general indicators are progressive weight loss, anything more than 10%. But I find serum albumin less than 2.5 grams, something that always warns me. Anybody who comes into hospital, especially into ICU repeatedly, or what we term a sentinel event. Like I told you about a fracture neck femur, which could do this, but it could also be psychological. The loss of a spouse, that's a sentinel event. Then we have guidelines for diseases. And as you can understand, these are the most predictable for cancer. So somebody who has recurrence and or metastasis after initial therapy with multimorbidities, not amenable to further treatment, you can predict that their survival is likely to be a matter of months. And in this situation, if the patient is spending more than 50% of their time in bed, then we estimate that the prognosis is 3 months or less. But for other organs, heart, lung, kidney, liver, it's not so clearly predictable. So you have all these multiple indicators that are listed. Let's look at liver disease, for instance. You have somebody with hepatocellular carcinoma or advanced cirrhosis where liver transplant is contraindicated, or somebody who has complications, refractory ascites, encephalopathy, or a bacterial infection. Well, you know that even given all of this, the patients do survive months and even years. So it's not as clear cut as for uh, cancer. And when you look at neurology, it tends to be pretty complex. Yet, we can still identify situations where we can tell the family that this patient is not likely to survive with any quality of life. And that is why for neurologic decline or for multimorbidities, we use the last trigger, and that is decisional. Decisional would apply, say, for somebody who has progressive deterioration, whose symptoms are complex and too difficult to control. For instance, swallowing problem leading to aspiration pneumonia, speech problems with increasing difficulty in communications. And we decide not to do anything more. Why is this important? Well, we now have the means to keep the body alive indefinitely, should we choose to do so. Three nonagenarians died in 2018. These two, Barbara and George Bush, died in their own beds. They literally died in Darbar with their families around them. Atal Bihari Vajpayee died in the AIIMS ICU after a period of on ECMO, which means full, complete, total support, on the 16th of August 2018, after the last Bradford speech was delivered of the previous parliament. Right. So let me take you to a few cases. So the first is this patient. He was a retired bureaucrat. He's actually not one patient. He's a combination of 2 or 3 patients of mine. And at the age of, he died when? So somewhere in the late 70s, he started to complain of forgetfulness. He was diagnosed with early dementia, started on medication, and he himself asked the neurologist, what is going to happen to me? There was no meaningful discussion. He had been working till then, but he had himself resigned from all his responsibilities because he said, I cannot cope. And as usual, wife and the two old couple living in the suburbs of Mumbai with the children settled in the USA. And through the years, 2014, 15, 16, 17, you could see this decline. He maintained independent daily routine in 2015, except that he once got lost and kept irritating his wife by asking the same question again. In 2016, supervision started to need more and more and would not leave his wife alone. And by 2017, behavioral issues were prominent. And sorry. And I think I'll have to put my phone off for a few minutes. Yeah. So he needed to be, in fact, rescued because he went out of the house alone. And you could see that the decline was in process. In January 2018, he got admitted with encephalopathy due to urinary tract infection And because his detrusor was not functioning, he ended up getting a cystostomy. And now he could still walk, but he needed supervision for everything and support for everything. And now it is the wife asking the doctor, "Ab kya hoga? What will happen?" No answer. So, end of that year, he came in with low sodium, and at the end of this, he was, well, completely bedbound, nearly mute, and completely dependent. Uh, a couple of months later, he got epileptic seizures. He came into the hospital. He got intubated, even though his fits were easily controlled with medications. Uh, in another 2 or 3, by the fifth day, he could be taken off the ventilator, extubated. I think he was extubated on day 5. But he did have some amount of problems, so then he ended up getting a tracheostomy on day 8. And eventually, because the family was very reluctant for the peg, there was a lot of discussion, including Palcare. Finally, he got a peg and he was discharged for home care on day 28. And on discharge, he was effectively in persistent vegetative state due to severe dementia. The son from the US actually asked, couldn't we have involved palliative care earlier? And he's now was living at home with hired caregivers. The family physician was being supported by our Palcare physician, developed bed sores, and finally in March 2019, aspirated and died. So, if you see the story, there were so many missed opportunities. The family, the patient could have been given some information about the roadmap ahead. And if that had been done at diagnosis, abroad, it is considered part of quality of care to discuss what the patient would like to have done to him when he or she cannot make decisions. That is called advanced care planning. At the first admission for UTI, he was no longer capable of making decisions, but his family could have been informed about the terminal nature of his illness, because by then it was sure that the dementia was rapidly progressing. At the second admission, well, there could have been a discussion about goals of care. Do you really want to do everything? Do you want him with a peg and a tracheostomy? Do you want to avoid future hospitalizations? If that had been done, maybe he would not have even been admitted for seizures. If he had come in for seizures, he would probably not have been intubated. Or he would, instead of getting a tracheostomy, have had a palliative extubation. And the last stage of his illness could have been cut short by 2 to 3 months. So that is one of my patients. So he was not really my patient, except that I saw him towards the end. Let me compare that with this other gentleman, about the same age, living in Mumbai, only daughter in the US, starts off with GI symptoms, intermittent constipation, turns out to have CA colon, and gets referred to an oncologist, oncosurgeon. The oncosurgeon does a left hemicolectomy, and the oncologist talks to him and his daughter. But the old man was very unhappy that the patient that he himself was not spoken to. It was the oncologist spoke to his daughter. That's something that we also do very often. When we have severe or terminal patients with severe or terminal illnesses, we don't talk to the patient. We talk to the relatives. Anyway, he got chemotherapy, tolerated well, except one episode of confusion. And then what happened is that because his grandson in the US identified the need for palliative care, he met a palliative care physician literally as his chemotherapy began. And he continued to follow up with the oncologist, except that the result in 2017 of a follow-up PET CT was terrible. There were extensive metastases in liver and lungs, and the survival expected was about 4 months. He was offered palliative chemo and was told that at best he could expect to survive 24 months. He had not had a very good experience in chemotherapy. So he said, no, enough is enough. Palliative care team got involved and hospice care was set up at home. In April 2018, there was a prolonged discussion with his wife, daughter, because he'd been declining. And see the story. The grandson asked for and got 2 months of leave from his new job. and flew to Mumbai to take care of his Nana, who was now in bed most of the time. The grandson made sure that his grandparents had made their documents ready. The PC team discussed anticipatory grief. And then, as he began to decline to the last stages, the daughter who had not been able to get leave now flew in. Literally, he hung on till he met her. And after greeting her, slipped into coma and passed away. So, see the differences between these two deaths. When it is a neurologic death, the trajectory is erratic and prolonged. There are recurrent admissions, which may be, well, sometimes unavoidable, but can be avoided at times. In dementia, the other big issue is that the patient loses personhood. In Mr. AZ, it was only at the time of diagnosis that he could have been asked what he wanted. After that, he was not there. And you often have expensive and avoidable ICU care at the very end. For cancer, you have a defined trajectory and prognosis. Admissions can be avoided, and patient and family retain control if there is transparency. Uh, but I am a neurologist, so uh, I know that the oncologists have a easy job. Uh, Unfortunately, we have the more difficult part of it. In fact, let us look at just sheer old age. Remember that human life expectancy is not expected to increase much beyond 80 years. But you also have to look at the concept of chronologic age versus biologic age. So, intermittently, you will see somebody who um, looks like they are 85, and then you see they're only 70 years old. Or you see somebody who looks like they are in their late 60s, and then you see the paper and you see that they are 82. So you have to understand there's this difference between chronologic and biologic age. And very often it's sentinel events that tell us that somebody has now begun the decline. So this patient was a housewife. And in 2014, she and her 87-year-old husband moved to a different city because they needed to live near and be supported by her only daughter. She had poorly controlled diabetes on insulin, and because she had spells of hypoglycemia, her daughter insisted that they had to be close to her. So she settled into new home. She insisted she wanted to do everything herself, but the daughter insisted on a cook and a maid. And she continued to have an active social life, except that in 2016, she had a febrile diarrheal illness, which really needed admission to the ICU, but she came out of that. But later that year, fall at home, fracture neck femur, hip replacement, transient post-op delirium, but walking with walker at 3 months. But well, things were not the same. The year after that, it was a husband. 3 days of vague chest pain, mild fever, and then suddenly the chest X-ray showed massive lobar pneumonia. He went into sepsis, multi-organ failure, and the old lady confirmed a do not intubate order. And he passed away 48 hours after admission. How did this happen? This happened because after her illness, when she had the fracture neck femur, both husband and wife spoke to their daughter, made it clear what their wishes were. In fact, they both wanted their bodies to be donated to the medical college. Anyway, so now the old lady was living alone, but her granddaughter moved in to live with her, and that was a major consolation for her. Except that by the beginning of 2018, her diabetes, which was as it is giving trouble, now she developed multiple superficial soft tissue abscesses, and she was admitted for intravenous antibiotics twice. Eventually, the abscesses would not heal, so she was discharged for home care with daily dressings. And she asked, "What is happening to me?" And she was told, "The medicines are not working." What did she say? "I don't want to go to hospital again." And she was a fairly stoic lady. She refused any painkillers stronger than paracetamol. She didn't want opioids at all. So this was March 2018. 1.5 months later, her activities started to come down. She was in bed most of the time, needing help with all basic activities except for feeding. Her appetite had gone down. This another 1.5 months later, she entered a phase of delirium, confused, a little restless. And then her hands and feet started to become cold. She became incontinent. 3 days later, she stopped speaking. And the day she stopped speaking, she stopped breathing later the same day. So, if you look at these three trajectories, let me come back to that slide I showed you earlier. And if any of you is interested, this is uh, free for download. It's a pretty long article, not very well known, but he discusses why uh, our prognostic function is so intimately tied down with bioethics. Remember that before the middle of the 20th century, diagnosis, therapeutics, and prognosis were three equally important functions. But as our treatments improved, the skill of prognosis declined in teaching, in research, and in practice. When you prognosticate it, you have to both foresee and foretell. When you foretell, you have to combine honesty, accuracy, and optimism. And you can do that if you're trained in communication skills because you understand how to put these things together. Um, if you do not learn how to foretell, or if you abandon your duty of foretelling, let me promise you that your skill of foresight will also atrophy. These two go together. You cannot have one without the other. So, what do we communicate at the end of life? Well, this communication, obviously, prognostication is a big part of it, but we combine this into three separate but overlapping areas. And these are now very clearly elaborated in palliative care as clinician responsibilities. These are called goals of care, advanced care planning, and shared decision making. And I'll just explain them to you. Goals of care is a clinician responsibility. You educate the patient and the family, and with the patient and family, you explore what they would want. And this is in addition to the usual discussion about treatments. It is not done in one go, it takes some time to evolve. Now, when the goals of care become clear, you have to document it, you have to make it actionable. Ideally, it needs choosing a proxy decision maker for the end of life when the person himself or herself cannot speak. And this ideally has to be legally valid and backed by public policy. In India, it is legally valid, but public policy is still missing. And then you go on to shared decision making, where you combine patient or family inputs with clinician input to make appropriate in the moment decisions. So, to set goals of care, well, patients and caregivers, you have to explain and communicate. You have to find out how much they understand and how much they want to know. There are people who will say, don't tell me anything, you make the right decision. You have to explain uncertainty. Probably the most crucial thing that you need to find out is patient's wishes about place of care at the end. And does the family and caregiver agree? These may change. There are times that the patient may say, I want to die at home, but the family says, we can't handle this. Right. So if you do this right, it improves the patient's quality of life because they have a sense of control over their last days. It reduces conflict in surviving family members, and it decreases use waste of money in ICU and CPR and so on. The challenges are obviously patients. Well, nobody wants to talk about death and find it difficult to think about these end of life issues. From our side, not only is a lack of difficulty, it's also our difficulty in discussing prognosis. Now, uh, if you look at it, the in addition to place of care and of death, other important decisions that have to be made is mode of feeding when the patient is unable to take oral. Will you put in a rice tube? Put in a peg? What about parenteral medications other than those required for symptomatic control? Will you give IV antibiotics, chemotherapy? Even IV fluids are life-saving treatment. And classic life-saving treatments like CPR, invasive ventilation, or dialysis. You need to make all these decisions. Remember that as we go through this process, families do not see the timeline of decline. You can look at my last patient. If you now look back at it, you can see how she was declining till the point that she eventually passed away. So, why don't we have these discussions? Families do not see it. Clinicians may also not see it, or see it and ignore it, or see it and get stuck because they don't know how to handle it. And I'll repeat this again. If you do not know how to foretell, your foresight will atrophy. To do this kind of communication is a learned skill. It takes training, it takes practice, it needs assessment. You cannot be, just because you're 30 years into practice, you are not a good communicator. Please take it from me. You need, before you become a guru, you need all these: preparation, procedure, and review reflection. It's something that most palliative care physicians take it for granted because that's their major job. But for the rest of us, we actually need to learn it. This is me trying to explain to one of my senior colleagues that they need to learn communication skills. So this is where we are. Now, I am going to uh, halt for a point and see if there are any questions. Dr. Sangamitra, any questions in the chat box?
No, sir, not as of now. I think they are all, absolutely ingrained into what you have been speaking. This is so beautiful. It's always a lovely thing to hear you. Yeah. I think yes, they will definitely have questions, sir. I think at the end of.
Please tell them to start putting them up in the chat box.
Excuse me,
please put
sir.
your questions. Yeah, bolo.
Yeah, there's a question, I think. Yes.
Sir, can you
great.
please, hello?
Yeah, bolo.
Sir, can you please explain जो आप कह रहे थे वो foreseeing and foretelling, मतलब I cannot be clear with that.
Okay. So foreseeing and foretelling, if you prognosticate, right? When you prognosticate, you are telling them what is coming in the future. But it is not a sterile exercise where you just do this and you keep this information in your own mind. You have to communicate it, you have to act on it, you have to assess your own prognostication. And that's why we call this together as foreseeing and foretelling. Remember, this comes from Hippocrates. You have to, if you do not commit to foretelling, your foresight, your prognostication skill will atrophy. That's what I meant. Is that clear or? Hello?
Not very clear, sir, but I'll try to understand it.
We'll come back to this. You'll see more
Okay,
of it as we go along.
Okay, sir. Okay.
Anybody else? Okay.
Sir,
Ha, bolo.
yeah, myself, Dr. Sanjay Pandya. Foreseeing and foretelling. Suppose we initially we practice and we turned out to be a wrong one sometimes. What is the medical implication or any sympathetic issues to the family?
If you do it right, and hopefully as you go through, I mean, as you join palliative care, you will realize that you are not you're not an oracle. You're not somebody who's always accurate. You have to communicate our uncertainty also together with this, but you have to inform them that this is the trend, this is where things are going. And as you see the rest of what I have to tell you, we'll come back to this discussion a little later, but just hear me out and then we will, because you see, unless you start warning patients and families towards the end of life, people cannot make decisions that are important for them. Right?
True. Okay.
Sir, there's another question from Dr. Ravin actually. So he's asking, how do you deal with the situation wherein the patient does not want to go to the hospital, but his children insist on hospitalization?
Right. So can we save that up for the end, because this one will need to be, Dr. Sangamitra will also have some comments on this.
Sure.
So we'll come back to this at the end. Remember that we talk of patients' rights, human rights. This is from a document that was published quite some time ago of patients' rights at the end of life. The important thing is to be treated as a living human being until the moment of death, to maintain a sense of hopefulness, even though the hope is only for next 2 days. to be cared for by somebody who can maintain a sense of hopefulness. So hope, accuracy, both can go together. And to be able to express feelings and emotions about approaching death in your own way. To be able to participate in decisions concerning your care. For that, that is where you need honesty. To expect continuing attention, even though goals have been changed to comfort, not to die alone, to be free from pain, to have your questions answered honestly, not to be deceived, to have help accepting death, and to die in peace and dignity. To retain individuality, to be able to discuss spiritual experiences, to expect that the sanctity of your body will be respected after your death, to be cared for by caring, sensitive, knowledgeable people who will attempt to understand your needs. These are all, this is my question. Unfortunately, my Slido isn't working, but do you think these are all part of our rights? I think they are. So who's responsible for making sure that we have all these rights? Well, remember that till about the 1940s, uh, medical progress really started after that. So that not only did people end up getting good ICU care, but people started surviving ICUs coming out, and eventually it came to the point where death became medicalized and people stopped dying at home. They only died in hospital. From the 70s onwards, as part of the human rights and consumer rights movements, medical paternalism began to end. So informed consent obviously had started from over the 1930s, 40s, but by the 70s, it really became solidified. And living wills, if you see, were first written by a human rights lawyer in Chicago. And for some reasons, the USA became the world's laboratory for these instruments, to the point that every state, every party started to get involved, and they saw that it spread rapidly all across. On the other side, from the United Kingdom came the concept of palliative care. This started in the 1960s, and by about the early 2000s, these were across all modern democracies, these were well entrenched. Remember that we have four pillars of ethics: autonomy, beneficence, non-beneficence, and justice. But there is also dignity and honesty, and others that we have to take into account are empathy, compassion, fidelity, and integrity. Now, to put this together, we use something called a four-box model. I'm not really going to go into the details here. This basically, in a given case, you look at medical indications, you look at patient preference, you look at quality of life outcomes after treatment is done or whatever is at the end, and then finally look at contextual features, which means justice. So, I mean, if you have a patient in the ICU, it obviously means that somebody else cannot get that bed. So that's where justice comes in. For us, the legal framework is the Constitution of India. Then we also have common law, because we are part of a system where judges, uh, judicial pronouncements are also part of our laws. The only actual law that we have is the Organ Donation Act. But there are professional guidelines, and there are these other acts that cover life and death. I have been involved in this since March 2011, because I was part of the medical team that examined Aruna Shanbag. And remember, that was the point when these decisions were effectively decriminalized. So that withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment from a person incapable of giving consent was taken out of criminal the context. And of course, in that particular patient, they confirmed that the patient was not brain dead, and that story ended. But this part of the judgment continued. In 2018 was a much bigger judgment, which made it very clear that all adults with the capacity to consent have the right of self-determination and autonomy. A competent person who has come of age has the right to refuse specific treatment or all treatment, or opt for an alternative treatment, even if such decision entails a risk of death. It is only in an emergency, when it is not practicable to obtain the patient's consent, that we can intervene. But where the patient has already specified their wishes, that they do not wish to be treated, then you have to give effect to that. It's not something that most of us do. Because this is a Supreme Court judgment, this is effectively the law of the land. Because they realized that often many people would not have an advance directive, they said that the same procedure and safeguards would be applied here as well for withdrawal. And we'll discuss this a little further. But unfortunately, the medical profession really doesn't get involved in this. There are many issues. As I said, there's difficulties in establishing prognosis. But it is also because we don't know how to discuss these issues. So I'm going to skip over this part of it because this is a separate lecture and come to the medical part of it now. The medical part of it is when we have gone past this bit of decision making that somebody is entering the last phase of life and we reach the stage where a person is actively dying. How do we know that? These are purely clinical symptoms and signs. Active dying are the hours or days preceding death, during which time the patient's physiological functions wane. There's less urine output, less eating, less consciousness, and we have to prepare the patient, the family, caregivers for the natural process of dying. The care has to be multidisciplinary and it has to extend after death. Remember that the signs and symptoms of end of life can start months to weeks. If you remember my last patient, uh, this was, I think, she passed away at the end of June, but literally in March, it was obvious that things had started to go down. So, pre-active dying is a process of physical and psychosocial withdrawal. Ambulation decreases. This is almost 50% happens. People start to withdraw from family and friends. Intake goes down, occasional incontinence, and weight loss. And these are overlapping with the features that I had told you when uh, uh, the triggers get activated, when the surprise question becomes obvious. Then, weeks to days before death, the brain starts to get affected. And this is the onset of delirium. And this is really the onset of active dying. So these patients cycle in and out of confusion. Blood pressure starts to go down, pulse becomes irregular, oral intake goes down, output goes down. They're completely confined to bed and their communication goes down. Once death is imminent, this is days to hours before death, vital signs start to go down. So consistently, the blood pressure stays down, may become unrecordable because there is an inability to swallow. Secretions get pulled and they get the death rattle. There is irregular breathing. There is decreasing consciousness. In addition, there is one more sign in breathing which is a little tricky to pick up. All of us can recognize gasping respiration, but sometimes you'll see somebody whose gasp is very, very subtle. All that happens is while breathing, they move the mandible. So mandibular movement in a patient who's towards the end of life also tells you that perhaps this is we are near the end. Hemodynamic changes, yellow sallow appearance, face relaxed, slack jaw, all of these become obvious. Now, our goals are to ensure the patient's comfort. You have to make the end of life peaceful and dignified, support the dying patient and their carers, focus on comfort. And one of the things that we have to do is start reducing unnecessary medications and, of course, management of specific symptoms. So, because families often get worked up over nutrition and hydration, and these are patients whose appetite is gone, there's aversion to food, nausea, and so on, you have to speak to the family and make them understand that feeding tubes do not enhance survival or quality of life. In fact, tube feeding, because once you put in tubes, you need to hold them down, you need to tie them down, you actually worsen the likelihood of pressure ulcers and do not reduce the risk of aspiration. This is because the body is shutting down and pumping in fluid really doesn't help. Typically, if it is uh, if it is not possible to see it, I usually see to it that fluids are restricted to about a liter. And if there is no catheter in place, then I ask them to see that they are passing urine about 3 to 4 times a day. Because once it drops below that, then you know that kidney function is also gone. Uh, Ideally, you have to have careful hand feeding with food items that the patient likes. Uh, Food may be mashed. For symptoms of thirst, the best is good mouth care together with ice pieces, small ice pieces in the mouth, and maybe some moistening of the lips. You have to remember that the body is shutting down, intake is going down. Remember that total fluid requirement is about a liter per day. And if you confirm that the patient is passing 3 to 4 urine 4 to 5 4 times a day, you know that things are still being maintained. Uh, as I said, hand feeding and no IV fluids. What about medications? Stop all medications that are not required for symptom control. And if any is required, then ideally they should be given subcutaneously. Antibiotics, aspirins, statins, vitamins, oral hypoglycemia. Remember, the sugar is dropping. If you want, you can monitor it, but we often even avoid that. Typically, you will find that sugars start to hover in the 150 to 200 range. They don't really go higher than that. Psychiatry medicines can stop. Now, the symptoms that bother the patient and family are pain, delirium, of course, incontinence, nausea and vomiting, and dyspnea, and you need to tackle them. Any medications that you need to give, the best route is the subcutaneous route because maintaining IV lines is difficult and not everybody likes rectal route. For pain, if you're not able to assess it verbally, you use validated scales. There's a scale called PAINAD in which you can see grimacing and see movement signs and so on, and you can get an estimate if somebody is in pain. Ideally, you will need opioids, and I'm not going to go into the details on that. Here again, if possible, oral, otherwise subcutaneous, and you may need to rapidly titrate in case of severe pain. For agitation or delirium, look at basic causes like retention, constipation, and pain. You must first check these out. If there are medications which cause delirium like anticholinergics, you must take them out. Increase natural light. If it is possible to make the patient walk even till towards the end or to mobilize them, try and do it. Remove anything that irritates the patient. Stop excess noise and engage the patient in conversations, but don't shout at them. If that doesn't work, then the drug of choice is haloperidol. Typically, I would start off with a quarter of an ampoule that is 1.25 mg. You can give more, but then you can settle down to 0.5 BD or something like that, and or 0.5 HS. And usually patients settle down. We avoid benzodiazepines because they can actually worsen delirium. For breathlessness, there are 4 principles. You correct the correctable, if need be with pleurocentosis or whatever else. You use air movement on the face. Even a fan next to the bed works. You reduce the perception of dyspnea with small doses of morphine. And if it is intolerable, then you may have to use palliative sedation. Similarly, for nausea and vomiting, correct the correctable or reverse the reversible. So the reversible are constipation, hypokalemia, and hypocalcemia. If this has been treated, then the first line drugs are haloperidol, metoclopramide, ondansetron. Haloperidol still enters this list because it's quite effective, and you may be using it for delirium as well. Other drugs that can be used are dexamethasone. Second line drugs include olanzapine, uh, and older antipsychotics are also sometimes used, but generally these first 3 should work. What about the death rattle? Again, the most important is family education, that this is not causing any distress to the patient. Typically, this occurs in 50% of dying patients. This is because swallowing reflexes are inhibited or bronchial secretions cannot be coughed up and swallowed. So, non-pharmacological management includes repositioning so that you put the patient in the lateral position and remove the secretions from the angle of the mouth using a finger wrapped in a gauze piece. We avoid suctioning because it stimulates more secretions. Pharmacological, well, glycopyrrolate and hyoscine are also drugs that we all should learn how to use. In addition to that, important nursing interventions include mouth care, pressure shock prevention. Ideally, these are patients who are all catheterized. There's no point in putting them to the risk of retention, and you have to, in addition, monitor for constipation. Now, there are 2 more modes of death that we need to be prepared for. Most patients will just stop breathing and heartbeat will stop. But in neuro patients, you need to worry about epilepsy, and in cancer, especially the head neck, you need to worry about something called the blowout hemorrhage. In neuro patients, epileptic seizures can start off towards the end, or there may be a previous history. If you are prepared for it, then you can use subcutaneous midazolam or anti-epileptic drugs. Levetiracetam can be given subcutaneously. Phenobarb can be given subcutaneously. Uh, Even fosphenytoin, although I would not recommend it, can probably be given subcutaneously. Now, the important thing to understand is that depending on your goals of care, if the goal of care is to for the end to occur at home, well, you basically sedate the patient, and even if you're not getting control of the seizures, eventually status will become quiet and it will become non-convulsive until the patient passes away. What about this? Blowout hemorrhage means an oral malignancy infiltrates neck arteries and causes the carotid artery to rupture. Now, this has to be discussed in advance with the caregivers. Here, they can be advised to you keep dark towels, preferably green towels around, because they don't show the color of blood, and you just cover the and ideally, if it happens, the palliative care team has to immediately rush and sedate the patient with midazolam. Right. Now, there is an entity called palliative sedation where the patient has, like, for instance, a blowout hemorrhage, or for instance, a refractory dyspnea, and you need to make the patient comfortable. You use sedation where your intent is to provide sleep and make the patient comfortable, but the process of death is continuing, and because of your medications, death may be hastened. This is different from euthanasia, because in euthanasia, there is an intent to terminate life, and you actually stop the natural process. Uh, that is why palliative sedation is considered an acceptable mode of intervention towards the end. Remember that the family needs support because they may be suffering as much and even more, and we have to be involved as needed. If this happens at home, you need to confirm death at home by confirming identity if you have not seen the patient before. Confirm that there are no signs of life, including pulse, and then you document it. For palliative care teams, there are the additional responsibilities of collecting back unused opioids. You need to support the family because they will go through normal grief up to about 6 months. Now, what you need to explain to them is that normal grief, I'll come back. I think that's a little further ahead. The family, the most important thing as you're taking the family through this is anticipatory guidance. If you explain what is happening and what is likely to happen and prepare them, they will not panic. You have to be available to answer questions. And if there are any religious concerns or wishes of the patient, you have to help organize that. Typically, families, neighborhoods, people come together to help, and you need to just spend a little time organizing that. Now, once somebody passes away, bereavement is that period during which mourning and grief occurs. Grief is the natural distress that we inwardly feel. Mourning is the outward expression of the grief. And remember that once somebody goes into a serious illness and goes down, they will have had multiple losses even before that and have had grief even before that. How we experience grief depends on our culture, religion, the nature of the loss, whether it's a sudden death or an expected death, and the relationship to the deceased. Anticipatory grief actually occurs before the patient passes away. There are other types of grief called acute, integrated, and complicated. We'll just discuss them in brief. Acute grief is that follows immediately after, and it usually declines over a period of several months. Typically, this grief has a wave-like character, and you have to explain it to families that there are times when they will really they'll feel the loss very, very severely, and then that tends to pass. And then you settle down, you get around with normal activity, then it comes again. And these waves gradually decline over a period of several months. Eventually, it gets integrated into the bereaved person's daily life and outlook. Now, if grief persists for an extended period of time, the minimum duration, well, people have qualified it differently, but it is 6 to 12 months. If it goes beyond that, then we call it complicated grief. It's our job to give bereavement support. Typically, I speak to my patient's family within a couple of days after the death, and then maybe once again after some time, maybe in a few weeks. You need to identify those caregivers who are at risk of complicated grief and then refer them appropriately. And you can also conduct bereavement support group lessons. Now, I'm going to uh, close this part of it with these key messages. Terminal illnesses can be identified. You have to shift focus to symptom control. The active dying phase has to be recognized, and you have to support family before death and after that as well. I also have a short, very short 5-minute thing on advanced care planning. If you are interested, we'll do it now. Otherwise, I can come back to it later if you have any questions. Sangamitra?
I think, sir, we should know about the advanced care planning.
Okay.
Yes, that's
Okay,
important.
so I think I've shown you this photograph, right? So over the next few years, after 2011 and 2015, three national medical associations, the palliative care, the neurologists, and the intensive care people came together. We formed a group called ELICIT, End of Life Care in India Task Force, and together with other people, there's a legal entity called Vidhi. We actually drafted this living will, which we think is pretty appropriate for Indian purposes. And this has multiple elements. It's a self-declaration. It identifies the treatments that a person would refuse, and you identify the surrogate decision makers or healthcare power of attorneys whom you would want to take care of all these to make sure that this is done. And remember that this is something that can be revoked orally immediately. I mean, so there are instances of people have become delirious and revoked it and then regretted it. So this document is available on the Pallium India website. It's available on Vidhi Legal Policy and the Indian Association of Palliative Care website, and you can download them. To make this, you need to actually start by speaking to your family. Then to choose your surrogates, the healthcare power of attorney. Confirm that they accept the responsibility, understand your wishes, and will follow them. There are times when some people will say that I don't want to give them any discretion, whereas most people feel that towards the end, because situations can be fluid, the healthcare power of attorney needs to have some discretion, because sometimes, for instance, an individual may go into an ICU, maybe intubated, get treatment, and actually get better. So those are decisions that sometimes have to be taken at the last minute. Now, this has to be signed in front of two witnesses, and ideally it should be attested by a judicial magistrate first class. I recommend that anybody who makes this shows this to every doctor, because you need to find out how doctors will support it, whether they can use it in their hospitals, and so on. I'm going to stop at this point, and if anybody has anything else, you will get this presentation from Pallium. But if you need to communicate directly with me, this is my email ID, and happy to answer any questions now. Can I stop sharing?
Yes, sir, sure. So I think we can start with Dr. Revin's question.
Case.
How do you
Okay,
deal
okay.
with the situation wherein the patient does not want to go to the hospital, but his children insist on hospitalization?
Why don't you want to handle that?
Please go ahead, sir.
No, I'm asking you if would you like to take that?
Okay, so if I have to deal with such a situation, I would actually make it a point to make the relatives actually or the children understand the importance of not taking the patient to the hospital, number one. Secondly, try to find out why they want to do it. That is very important. What is that is making them insecure if the parent is to be at home, and perhaps then I would be able to find out the reasons of there's nobody to take care, or they, even if there is someone to take care, they are not, to say, medically trained to look for the danger signs that could come up. So things like that, those issues. And then perhaps, if there are solvable part of those questions, I would like to give them some workable solutions on that. And then, maybe try to find out a common space where they also agree on what we are generally expecting them to agree on. So I think that is what I'm going to do. Sir?
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree. You have to find out why. I mean, there are times when the patient may not want to go, but the family says, I can't handle this. Then you are the person who has to come in between.
This is always on our part to, as Roop sir had already told us, communication skills are the ones that are really going to help us handle all kind of situations. And I think we are blessed to be trained so properly in communication skills. I cannot say I am too much trained in that, but yes, every situation that we face every day in and out with our families, with our patients, I think those give us a lot of opportunities, a lot of situations which are very unique to us only, I think, because we do deal with situations which do not generally give us a very good outcome, in the sense that, we cure people, we do not deliver babies so that koi hame aake mithai khila raha ho. So yes, we have to deal with these situations. So I think I'll do that only. Dr. Ravin, you have any comments on that?
No, ma'am, there is some, we face situation.
Dr.
take to the
Ravin, you are
hospital, but
muted.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, better now.
Yeah.
Can you hear?
Yeah.
Yes.
Good.
Yeah. See, there.
No, again, you're gone. Anybody else? Anybody else has any questions in the meantime?
Is it, can I discuss one situation, Dr. Roop? I
Go
am
ahead,
Dr.
go ahead.
Rakesh Mittal. I'm a retired medical pediatric oncologist.
Okay.
Yeah, this is regarding my sister who is currently admitted in the corporate hospital. She's 76-year-old. She has multiple medical issues, like she is a case of CKD. Her latest creatinine is now 6.2. She has diastolic cardiac failure, and now she has developed lung infection with pleural effusion. And she also has a ulcerative colitis, has a very restricted diet. Now the doctor today was saying that her condition is deteriorating. She requested me that she want to go home. Please take me home. I don't want to stay here. Doctor want to put a central line, and if required, maybe take her to ICU. Because I don't say that doctor has to do whatever they are supposed to do. Now her only daughter is in USA, who is insisting, Mama, abhi aisa kuch decision mat lena, let her remain in the hospital. Now, in this situation, what should I do, sir?
Dr. Bora, Madam will take this question. Both of us will take it because it's a complex one.
Yes, sir, Dr. Mittal, we are often faced with this kind of situation, because I know how it is like to convince your colleagues at the first place about this kind of a situation. Because I feel, well, if I have to be very rude, I would say that, okay, if this patient, I'm earning some money out of it, why not? That is one. I'm being very rude. I'm really sorry about this, but this is something that
It's
happens.
not like that. I tell you, Dr. Sanghmitra, it is
Okay,
not like
that's
that.
good.
because she is still potentially treatable. Like they
Right.
say that lung infection may, if she comes out of this lung infection, maybe she will, her kidney function may be little better. So they are trying their best. But the
Yeah.
patient is insisting that no, I don't want anything more. I
Okay,
have
so
answered.
So I
okay,
think we need,
so
yeah, yes, sir.
so one way, see, so this is a situation where negotiation are required. Okay, so your job is, or my function in this situation is to negotiate between the patient, the medical system, and the family. It's almost a tripod that you're working in
But here
between.
I am the family. I am the
Yeah,
youngest
so
brother. I am the youngest brother also.
yeah, but if you look at it in some ways, if her only family is her daughter, if her husband, her spouse is not there,
Yeah, she's a
then
widow. She's a
yeah,
widow.
so then it really, the surrogate first is her daughter. You come after that.
Yeah.
Okay, so the daughter's wishes also have to be taken into account, and the mother perhaps has to be spoken to about that. Said she may have to be told that although you may suffer a little while, we may be able to take you through this period. Okay, but there will be some amount of suffering. You can assure her that we will not let it go on indefinitely. So we call this a time limited trial of ICU therapy. Typically, this is a negotiated intervention that does not last longer than 5 days. Usually, we say 3 days. So, if you want to put in a central line and so on, then you would give it a period of 3 to 5 days. If there is a question of intubation and a question of loss of ability to communicate, that is something that I would listen to her. If she says, I do not want that under any circumstance, I would accept her
No,
wishes.
she has already told no intubation. That is
So
very
then,
clear.
so then, short of that, say that we will manage pain, but short of intubation, can we do everything? Perhaps you can leave it to her to decide if she wants to be there to meet her daughter. If she says even that doesn't matter to me, then again you have to accept that.
Right. Because I am going through a big dilemma these days.
Yeah. So I would argue for the central line, but I would accept her wish not to be intubated.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much.
Sir, on the contrary, sir, if there is a situation that the patient doesn't want, but the family wants it, and you feel that maybe in a later state, you may be in a legally compromised position, then
No,
what?
no. So legally compromised position, I think we need to recognize that the patient's wishes are paramount if they are adequately documented. If the patient is in completely in conscious mind and says, I do not want this. If for instance, his sister says, no, I don't want the central line, then he cannot have it put. The doctor cannot have it put.
Roger,
Regardless of
because
what the
that is
family
her
says.
body.
Yeah. Regardless of whatever the family says.
Understood.
I
And
think
and
that's
and
where our advanced directives also come over. And we can actually try to introduce advanced directives, which are already legal in India.
yes, ma'am. But there are many situations again where we land up where the patients entering to us with, in a position where they are not been able to give any their decision of theirs own, maybe regarding their treatment. But we need, but patient is repeatedly coming to us for dialysis. In the known case of CKD, every 15 days, patient lands up with a history of breathlessness. Then immediately we are putting on an NIV, we do a dialysis, recover the patient goes back home, and then again comes with fluid overload, or patient needs to be intubated. And the patient relatives, they don't understand, because since we are in government setup, then patient many times since it is free, they are so unko samajh mein nahi aata. Then what to be done in that case?
Okay. So again, here we come into the question of prognostication. So one is that the patient at this stage may not be in a position to really make their own decisions because they are often delirious. So you have to go by speaking to the family. The family must be clearly explained what the prognosis is. And this is where uh, you cannot say that this is a patient who's going to, you cannot give 100% prognosis, but if you give a range of prognosis, say that she is unlikely to survive beyond a year, explain the kind of suffering that she's undergoing, and also explain that we have the ability to control her suffering, maybe not cure her, but to comfort her. You see, very often, because we do not promise that comfort for families, they cannot bear to see them suffer. So
Understand.
when you say that you are no longer proceeding for cure, but you will continue to care, you will make sure that the patient will not. That's, literally this has to go into the same sentence, that we may not be able to cure her, but I will make sure that she does not suffer. Once that assurance goes through, families do accept it.
Understood. Thank you.
I think, sir, the most important thing here in this particular case is that the families are insecure that what happens after dialysis. If the doctor stops doing the dialysis, what will happen, and what is the further course of treatment? If they say treatment, because many times patients and families are concerned about the treatment part. So if we make this particular roadmap, as you said, clear for them, that we are not going to do the dialysis, but we can actually proceed in this particular manner, and perhaps they will be able to find out, they'll be able to accept that.
So, sir, actually, in a critical situation in ICU, sometimes what happens is patient is not able to communicate, but the relatives who are available, they may be doing, may not be sufficient in numbers, because they may be a 3 or 4 sons. Somebody, only one son is available at the ICU, and they tell to take some drastic decisions. How far legally we should legalize them on paper? Because
This
2
is
or
this
3.
is called, so this is called surrogate hierarchy. Yeah. So I'm actually typing it in the. We call this the surrogate hierarchy. So if the patient is not able to communicate, you start off with the spouse or the person who is like the partner of the patient, or anybody equivalent to that. If nobody is around, then it is the person who's taking care of the patient. But ideally, it is spouse. Then come adult children. Then come siblings and parents. Then comes the rest of the family. And within each category, ideally, it should be uh, either a majority or it should be a consensus amongst them. So if the spouse is there and the spouse makes a certain decision, then it doesn't matter what the children say or want to say. Legally, it is a spouse who has first right. But what you are saying is actually quite a common situation with us. So what we do is, when we are proceeding to making these decisions and we are documenting them, we do what is called as due diligence. So I will, our palliative care doctor will find out what is the family. And if it is obvious that there is a part of the family that is not accessible to us, we ask them to get either email or a phone confirmation, or failing all of that, then the person who is there gives us a written, some places even ask for an affidavit saying that I am responsible for the rest of the family. Yeah. But if you have done this, if you have documented it, and these decisions, so on both sides, even on the medical side, if it is happening in the hospital, it should be a minimum of 3 consultants who sign out on it. It's not like you and your registrar sign out. No, it has to be 3 consultants who agree that this is now a futile end of life care situation. The family must be in consensus. It is not okay if the wife says one thing and say for instance, the one son says one thing and the other son says another thing. I mean, obviously the wife is not there. So if there's a conflict within the family, we stop, we don't proceed. You understand? So whenever we are proceeding for this, we need complete consensus on both sides and between the 2 sides.
So, sir, if wife is there available, then complete dependence on a wife is okay. Even son says in a different way and wife says in a different way, that wife needs to be followed.
Ideally, in a family, unless there's a very, I mean, it's a say once in a while you will have a second wife and children from the first wife. That becomes a complicated situation. So in that kind of a situation, frankly, I would involve the hospital administration and perhaps even go so far as to say, please get a legal decision. But if it is straightforward, I mean, the mother and her children, it's very unlikely that they will be in different directions. They will be talking to each other, but they will generally come together.
Anytime a notary involvement or a judiciary involvement would help.
So we are, see, at this moment, we are not really involving them because we know that these things take too long. But if you are really stuck and somebody is really stuck, I think it will go directly to the High Court. It has to go to the High Court. It can't be dealt with at the.
Sir, is there any format for basically taking the consent of the relatives in this perspective?
So you can use, if you look up, let me see if I can find it. I'll put it up in the chat box. The AIMS has evolved a set of end-of-life care guidelines. And I think they are accessible to, I mean, you can just download them.
So is there any address, sir?
End of life care guidelines. Just a minute. Give me. If I can get it for you. Yeah, here they are. I'm putting the link up. You'll get all the documents and all the forms that they use. I mean, everybody uses their own thing. We have our own thing, but because this is AIMS, you can use these documents. Here, I put it up in the chat box. The surrogate hierarchy that I spoke of, that is also there in that document. Right? We are running out of time, I think. No, we still have about a minute to go.
Yes. Any other questions that we can list? So Dr. Sujata had a very good actually comment. She says there are no questions, but I agree with how we sometimes need to train our senior colleagues in communication.
So, yeah, so I think it's important that, see, palliative care learns communication skills by default. I mean, that's the most important skill that people in palliative care learn. So to all of you here, it's good if you can help us set up these courses in your own hospital locally. We can always try and find who is available close by, and see that we support you in doing it. Of course, currently, until the COVID situation settles down, we are not in-person, things are not possible, and communication skills are probably best done in person. So, but another few months, and I think we should be able to start. And I think it's important for all of us to at least spread this word.
Sir, if I could request you to share your experiences when you had shown that particular cartoon. So I think we'll be able to take home some more of your learnings.
No, so no. I mean that was again, as you said, being a little rude. But so the juniors understand. Typically, nurses understand. So when you are communicating, typically as you look around, you will see that your registrars start to get the message, and they start beginning to know how to follow this. You have to work with younger people. You have to work with younger people. But that's the way all new things will start.
Dr. Sujata has actually, she said, I related so much to the cartoon. I think, you're just beginning to have these experiences. But I think, sir, we've actually.
Yeah.
No?
Sahil, I'll call you back. Yeah. Okay. So are we done? I have a couple of calls.
I think, yes, sir. We are already done. Any question would be welcome. But then Roop sir is always there in WhatsApp. You have a problem, just text him and he's going to give you the correct answer to it. So thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
It's
Nice
always lovely to hear you out and take all kinds of learnings from you. And we look forward to more of such sessions by Pallium and many other organizations. Maybe you can start your own virtual sessions. That would be really very good, because neurology is also one thing that we have to, I can't say master, but then yes, we need to know a lot in palliative care in neurology. But this has been a wonderful session. I think we all have taken very good lessons from today's session. And thank you so much once again. Shri Priya, it's over to you.
Thank you, ma'am.
I'm
Thank
going to
you.
jump off.
Yeah.
I'm going to leave. Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr.
everybody.
for
Bye,
your
sir.
valuable time. Bye. So that brings us to the end of 18th session of our cohort, end of life care. So please do leave your feedbacks because it is very valuable for us. The link has been provided in the chat box and will be shared in the WhatsApp group as well. Till the next session, this is Sri Priya along with Dr. Sanghamitra Bora signing off from the Tips Ecodex. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.